listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast by Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, Dr. Fredrick J. Long, Dr. Mario Melendez, Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and J. M. Smith. Welcome and enjoy.
Welcome back. I'm Fred Long, and we're looking at Ephesians in our Ephesians group Bible study, Ephesians Greek Reading Group. And last time we ended by looking at the end of chapter 1. And there we see in 22 a reset of the grammar. And there are two main verbs in 22. First, that God has subordinated all things, forward emphasis here, quantitative emphasis, submitted all things under his feet. So here you have a prepositional phrase, under his feet, and gave him to be head over all things for the benefit of the church. So God subordinated and then gave him to be a head. Now the avton and kephalein it's a double direct object. And usually when this occurs, one can be designated as internal and one external. And that's a helpful classical category. My classical professor described this. Sometimes you'll hear a person and object, different distinctions, but I find that this internal, external is almost always helpful to consider. And the external one starts outside of the action of the verb. In other words, it's already kind of in existence. And then the internal object is the one that's kind of made or transferred through the action of the verb. And in this case, he gave him, so Christ is already there, he gave him to be a head. And so the head, this position of head, is what's generated in the action of the verb. And so you have internal, external object. And we're dealing with a body metaphor. So Christ is the head. And then now we're just looking for a body. So he has a foot, he has feet, he's got a head. And then in verse 23, we see etis estin to soma. And this is referring back to the church, which is his body. And the etis there is called an indefinite relative pronoun. It combines tis with a, which is the relative pronoun. So you have a relative pronoun there, and then the tis is an indefinite pronoun. So this pronoun type actually combines two forms. And so it's an interesting marking, and we might wonder what is achieved by that. And one grammarian observed that often this kind of pronoun can suggest some kind of support to what comes before it. So the etis, in some sense, through its elaboration, because that's what relative pronouns do, right? They're often added to provide more information about an entity. They start a subordinate clause, which I put brackets around. That's why I'm putting my hands like this in brackets. So in this case, this kind of pronoun is particularly helping to support this claim or explain this claim that he is head over all things for the church. And here, if you can substitute a since or because, you can kind of catch the logic there, which I think this type of indefinite relative pronoun may help to convey, since it is his body. You see how I can do that? So rather than saying which is his body, I can say since it is his body, that is, the church is his body. And so this head-body relationship is an important one in Ephesians, as we'll see. And this body is then given appositional explanation by abutting this noun to it. And I will argue that this is, rather than the fullness, to understand it as the fulfillment of, and then you have a substantive participle, the one fulfilling all things in every way. And that could be understood as Jesus or God. You have to debate who is the referent there, who is the one doing the fulfilling. And I think if we go back to 1:10, we remember that God has appointed Jesus, which he appointed or set in effect in Jesus for the administration of the fulfillment of the times. So God is fulfilling the times, but he's set in over this fulfillment Jesus. He's purposed this and set Jesus over the administration of this time. And so there's some sense in which Jesus, God in Jesus, they are fulfilling everything. And I think this has to do with salvation history, what God is doing in time and space through the saving activity of Jesus. So fulfilling everything that God has promised in every way that he can. Okay, so in chapter 2, we pick up with a ke, and this shows continuity. So we've already seen 22 ke, and then another ke, and then in 2:1 we have another ke. Now 2:1 begins a very long sentence. In fact, it's what's called anakaluthin. It's kind of a rambling. It doesn't really have a main verb. And in fact, it resets in verse 5. And so it's connected through verse 5, but we don't get the main subject and verb until, the subject is introduced in 4, and then we start getting some main verbs in 5b and 6. And so we'll maybe see if we can get that far, because otherwise verses 1, 2, and 3 is like a long, disconnected setup. In some ways, it's ungrammatical. It's anticipatory of a grammar that's occurring in 4 and 5. Now, this is an interesting point because in Greek rhetorical education and work on style, your content should match grammar. Grammar should match the content. So here the grammar is kind of breaking down in a sense, like it's ungrammatical in a certain sense, but it's precisely at the moment that God is describing humanity that is disconnected and broken. So the grammar is like broken as he's describing the brokenness of humanity. Now, is that accidental? Is that on purpose? In other words, it's disjointed. It's cut off. In fact, the only way that it makes sense is by its grounding with a reset. And that reset precisely has to do with God loving us. And that's what begins to make any sense of the grammar of 1 and 2 and 3. So I find that very interesting in this description of human sin and transgression, which causes us to be dead. And so that's where we're found. That's where we're found. So I think we're in the narrative or the narratio of Ephesians. I think Paul has switched from praying for them, hearing about their faith, going to prayer, to then descriptions of God's power, of raising Jesus up and seating him in the heavenly places far above. And then you have these two coordinated statements of setting all things under his feet and gave him to be authority, to be head over all things for the church. And so that's kind of Paul's narrative of praying, and he's praying that they would have illumination to understand the things of God, really, and God in Christ and what God has done in Christ. But in 2, the narrative continues by a focus on our problem, like our condition, which doesn't make any sense or can't even be rectified until God meets us in mercy and love. And then the grammar rectifies, the grammar gets kind of put back into place, human life gets put back into place. You see how this is kind of all connected. It's very interesting just to think of Paul's grammar here. So how does 2 begin? So the ke is adjoining it to the previous reality, to the previous utterances. So this ke is marking continuity, but it's really developing the story from the perspective down below. So a lot of times we have, we can talk about theology above and then a theology from down below. And so Paul has been looking at things from up high, the end of chapter 1, well, really all of chapter 1, and now in chapter 2, he starts to look at it from down below. And he gives us a glimpse of what we might call his anthropology. And it's not a pretty sight. It's ungrammatical. There are all kinds of bad influences. There are consequences of that. And fortunately, though, that's not the end of the story, because de in verse 4, this conjunction de, is a new development. It's a distinctive development. And that development of meeting humans in our messed up condition is God being rich in mercy. Thank God for God's mercy. God's mercy meets our sinfulness, and that is the game changer. That is the rectifier. That is what sets humans back on the right course. So I just want to kind of explain that kind of context as we unpack this grammar. So really this accusative case is really linked back to verse 5. So if you go to verse 5, you can see that there is a picking back up of us while we're dead in our trespasses. So God, while we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive with Christ. So that's verse 5. So that's where we are. That's where the grammar is going to pick back up and make sense. So the precursor to that, though, is this long description. And it starts out with this participle ontas, and then we see a prepositional phrase with elaboration, another prepositional phrase in verse 3, and then the reset in verse 4 with a de. All right, so I think ontas, one way to translate it would be, and while we were dead, or as we were dead, with respect to or because of our trespasses and our sins. So these are datives. Tis paraptomasin ke tes amartias umon. These are probably dative of causes. Dead because of. So while we were dead, because of our trespasses and sins, in which once, and really it's not we, it's a you, umas. So the change between 2, 1, and 5, it was subtle, so subtle I missed it here, is a change from you to a we. Now this is significant because he's going to add the we in verse 3. And I think this is important to observe because the you is particularly in reference to the addressees as the nations, as Gentiles. The we picks up Paul as a representative and as a part of Jewish people who he's going to describe in verse 3, together with the you. But in 2, 1 and 2, he's describing the you. And I'm going to tease this out in a way, and I think it'll make sense to you. So in 2:1, 2:2, NS refers back to sins, amartias. NS goes back to amartias, I know that because this is feminine, plural, and it goes back to the feminine plural noun. Now, it just happens to be dative. That's accidental. It's a relative pronoun. This is starting a subordinate clause. So remember that relative pronouns take the case of their clause, but they typically take the gender and the number of the noun to which they're referring. And so we can see this is feminine plural going back to amartias. So in which once you walked, you lived, parapateo, to live or to behave, to walk literally. It refers to a conduct of life. This is aorist, active indicative. The sate ending helps me tell me that. The augment sneaks in behind the preposition and abuts to the stem. So you have an augment there, plus the sate indicates aorist indicative. So he says, you once walked in sins according to the age of this world. And then another kata, kataton arkontates exousias tus eros, according to, and then here there's debate about how to translate this, the prince or the ruler. It's from archon, the ruler of the authority of the air. And then you have a comma, tu pneummatos tu nun energuntos, the spirit. And then you have an adjectival participle, which is working now. And then you have an entis huiis tes epithias, among or in the sons of disobedience. Of disobedience is what we would call a descriptive genitive, disobedient sons, or among disobedient children. So these two kata phrases is of course a matter of debate. What do they mean? Kata indicates a standard, according to, so there's a correspondence, it matches. So it somehow is explaining more about how they once lived. So once, pota, this adverb is important. You formerly lived this way. And the kata is indicating a kind of standard or a point of comparison or basis to how they lived. Okay, so it's in broad terms according to the age of this world. And I think he means this comprehensively. But then the second kata, people will say, well, that's just restating it. Is that just restating it, or is it going into more detail? I don't think they're identical. I think that the second is going into more detail. And then, of course, this is the big question, is who is this ruler? Who is this ruler or this prince? Notice that it's an accusative case. And then who or what the heck is this authority of the air? Exousias. What is that in reference to? And then people will say, well, obviously, this is the spirit. This has to be Satan. Okay. It's a really weird way of talking about Satan for Paul to do it this way. And what interpreters will often do is say that the spirit, which is in apposition, refers to this whole complex of ideas, the ruler or the authority of the air. The problem with that is that in the Greek, these are two different entities. The prince is accusative case as the object of kata. And then you have this authority of the air, which is genitive. Both of those are genitive. And so this appositional statement, tu pneummatos, is referring back to a genitive noun because it is genitive. So what that means is that the spirit cannot be going back to arkonta. It has to be going back to either authority or the air. And this would suggest, with the grammar, that you have two entities, a ruler, and then this authority of the air, which is a spirit. And moreover, a spirit that's now working among the sons of disobedience. Well, this is an interpretive problem. Yeah.
Dr. Long, isn't there a field or specific meaning when kata follows an accusative?
According to?
Yeah.
Yeah. According to. Yep.
So
this genitive is somehow modifying the head noun ruler or prince.
So the meaning kind of like have to stop with that as the object of that preposition?
Kind of. Yeah. I mean, this is all part of the complex, and so we have to ask well, first of all, what is this thing? This has led, interpreters to say, well, this is Satan because he controls the things of the air. Demons and spirits were thought to live in the air.
I mean, Juno is understood as that, but this is Ephesus, but...
Yeah. It's a real difficulty. Why is... Paul knows in Ephesians he refers to the devil. He refers to him in Ephesians. So why isn't he just referring to him as in a more simple term here? Well, as I've done research across Ephesians, extensive research and published and researched this, this idea of a ruler, particularly if Paul is talking about you Gentiles used to live in this age was dominated by Rome. And it was thought to be a golden age of Rome. And so I'm thinking that this ruler is the emperor. In other words, the standard of living, kind of the person that you looked to exemplify good living, was Augustus, were the subsequent emperors. The emperors were the epitome of what it meant to be a Roman, and they were exemplary. So I think that the archon, and if you look at archon across the New Testament, it refers to people. So since this is a different entity than the authority of the air, which is a spirit, so then I was stuck saying, okay, what is this authority of the air? So I'm researching this, and eventually I begin to find ancient commentaries called scholia. They're called scholia of ancient texts interpreting allegorically air as a reference to Zeus, because Zeus controls the things of the air. He has authority there. And in fact, I kept finding this again and again. Sometimes ether is used, sometimes air is used. Technically, ether was above the air. So Zeus probably technically abided in ether. Ether was the highest heavens. Below that was an air sphere. But Zeus controlled the air because he controlled rain, lightning, storms. And so anyway, this is now published as an essay. Really fun research. And behind the Roman emperor was thought to be Jupiter Zeus. Zeus is represented 2.5 times more than any other deity. People would have understood this connection. We've lost the connection because we don't think this way, but in the ancient world, people knew this. Plutarch even talks, Roman Questions, he had a book called Roman Questions. I think it's in that one. He has another treatise on Greek questions, and he talks about why do the priests of Jupiter, why do they go around cloaked? It's because they're walking around in the air and they don't want to be seen by Jupiter, and so they cloak their heads. So interesting, there's a whole set of beliefs and understanding here that we've lost. And the grammar here is suggesting two entities. If the ruler is the emperor, if the age is the Roman age of this world, that is what's happening right now, if Paul is talking to Gentiles, then their point of reference would be the Roman Empire, it would be the ruler, and behind that ruler is Zeus Jupiter. Every rule comes from Zeus Jupiter. So Diochrysostom begins his kingship orations with making that claim, quoting, I think, Homer. So again, this research is out there, it's published, and I'd be glad to get it to you. It might be on my Academia edu site. And so this is a spirit that is working among the sons of disobedience. And this language of sons of disobedience may harken back to the Qumran community. People have seen connections between Ephesians and Qumran. And there is described in the war scroll a war between the Kittim and then the ruler of that group, which is called Beliar or Belial, which means worthless in Hebrew and Aramaic. One of a student here at Asbury wrote an article that's published that searches that background based on some of initial research that I did. It's in an essay as well. So I think there's a reference here to the spirit. Now, is Paul, in his mind, is he connecting that with Satan? Very possibly. Is he demonizing Jupiter Zeus? Definitely. This is not a good spirit. This is a spirit that causes disobedience and sets up humans as his offspring that are opposed to God and God's ways. And so Paul says, you used to, in your sin, amartia, you once walked in this sin, this general malaise of sin that covers the Gentile world, really all of humans, but particularly you, not Jews. See, the Jews did not have as their standard the emperor. At least they shouldn't have. That was not their standard. Over the nation of Yahweh, over the nation of Israel was Yahweh as God. And so all these other nations have other deities that they might flirt with, but not Israel, not the people of God. So when Paul in verse 3 switches to include we also, that becomes inclusive of Jews, himself and the rest of humanity. So at this point, the breadth of Paul's discussion expands to include both ethnicity, all ethnicities, the people of God, the Jews, and the non-Jews. And to me, there's a question about this is, in is. Now, how do we parse that? En is. We might think, oh, well, that has to be masculine. Well, no, it could be also dative. Okay, this could be dative. So in form, it's dative plural or masculine plural, second declension. So people often take it as masculine plural, and they say that it goes back to weus, eus, tus eus, the sons of disobedience. And then they'll say, among whom we also all conducted ourselves once, or lived. But I want to suggest something to you, is that if the NS goes back to amartias, perhaps the NUs goes back to tus paraptomasin, back in verse 1. And what that would, the benefit of that is it helps to make sense of the parallelism. Look at the parallelism between these two relative pronoun clauses. Do you see that they each have pote? They each have a verb of action or behavior. And so when you add up the relative pronoun pote and a verb of behavior, they're all of a sudden in parallel. And so this might help us understand that the use might be going back to transgressions. Now the difference here between paraptomasin and amartias is amartias is like sin undefined. It's kind of like it's missing the mark generally, whereas paraptoma is more of an overstep of a known boundary. So there's a slight difference between those terms. And so Paul is saying that while generally the Gentile world was stuck in sin, generally, and also in terms of oversteps, that the Jews were really come into the picture when it comes to oversteps, paraptomasin, which, we can maybe think of it. Why? Because they had the law given to them. And so they're automatically, Paul says that the law increased awareness of sin, but we knew that sin was there all along. How do we know that sin was there in humanity? Remember how he argues that in Romans 5? We know that sin was present from Adam to Moses. Remember what the reason is that he gives? Because all die. So death is a consequence of sin, but the law came to make us more aware of transgression. And Paul has a discourse on one of the benefits of the law, one of the consequences of the law, but benefits is to make us aware of our sin. So in verse 3, he expands to include we also. So ke is thematic addition, marking thematic addition. We also, we have this emphatic pronoun use, which indicates the addition of not just you, but we. And then the pontes is also stressing scope. And no one at this point is excused. So no one is excused. We all have been walking in missteps of some kind or another. We've all acted poorly once. We've all lived. So ana strepho is a really fascinating word. If you want to do word study, it's really good. It has some cognates, good meaning in the New Testament, very doable. So ana strepho. We all lived once. Now, in what way did we live? What's the manner? Well, we start getting this description. Entes epithumias te sarkos emon. How would you translate that?
The lusts of your flesh.
Yeah, in the lusts or desires, plural, of our flesh. So he's including himself, and no one's off the hook. No one's off the hook. Everyone is on the hook here, because it's all, we all. And so in other words, when he's describing sin, it's not just a Gentile problem. It is a Jew and Gentile problem. And we all know that because of our interior struggles and how we've been led away. We've conducted ourselves according to the desires of our flesh. And then this is elaborated by a post-nuclear participle. That is a circumstantial participle that's located after the main verb. Piuntes ta telemata de sarkos, ke ton dia niun. Doing the wills or the desires of the flesh and of the reasonings. Plural. And I find this very interesting. So the wills is plural. And basically what this something I take away from this is that in a fallen state we're conflicted. We're conflicted. Our desires pull us in multiple directions, right? And we're at odds with ourselves, really. That's what sin does, is it fragments us, it divides us, it confuses us. One day we're pulled this direction, next day that direction. We become rather whimsical in our living. We justify things way too easily. We just are pulled. We're pulled. And that's what Paul is saying, is we're pulled in these different directions. So we got these epithumia, this desire. We also have wills. These, and the word will can also mean desire, but it engages a bit more intentionality. And so that makes us even more culpable in a sense, right? So it's one thing to say, I can't help it, I felt like I had to do this. But when you start talking about thelema, we're getting into more intentionality. And so, in other words, there's some intellectual engagement here. So we can't just say, oh, well, my body made me do it. No, at this point, Paul's saying, your mind is fallen too. And we get that real explicitly because we have ton dianoon, which is from dianoia, which has to do with mind. And so here Paul is describing kind of this mental capacity in action.
Like disposition of mind.
Yeah. Yeah. A faculty. It's really a faculty, yeah. Our faculty of thinking, kind of like our base core faculty. In a real sense, our mind is like we're computers infected with a virus, and we're like not aware of it. The law comes around and says, hey, you've got a problem in your execution. And we can go, oh, okay, I have to re-execute this. But in the end, the virus is still there. And so this is a deep-seated problem. It comes out of our flesh, and we don't want to dichotomize flesh and spirit. Paul basically means by flesh. Flesh can be used in a positive sense in Paul, sarx. But it is, a lot of times he means it in the sense of when we are left to our own devices, our own self. It's kind of seeing ourself as just a physical being. And that physical being is beautifully made. It's just that it's fallen. And when we see ourselves only as that, we're limited to that, that's when we get into problems, because then that becomes our own self-reference, a point of reference. When our bodies become our only point of reference, we're going to be pulled in all kinds of directions. We have these desires, and we'll do them. And our minds are infected as well, and it's just a big problem, and it causes us to be dead. So to be walking in sin and to be dead. Yeah.
You think that applies to senses of identity?
Yes, I think everything is affected by this. Yeah. So the question is, does this affect our sense of identity? I think absolutely so. I think this is why our identity, so much of what Paul writes about, so much of what Jesus himself affirmed, is that we're born again, we're born anew, and we're adopted. Like, we're fully adopted. And that adoption is huge. That means that we have a new family, and that our sense of identity, even the God that we worship, is dependent on our family lineage. And so the fact that Paul is writing to these Gentiles and saying, guess what? You're adopted in Christ. It gives them a new birthright and a family name that legitimates their worship of God. So much of, I was reading an article by Paula Fredrickson, and she just lays this framework out, very helpful to understand that worship was often connected to heredity. And so you're supposed to worship your clan gods. And if you don't do that, you're wronging your people. And so if this is the kind of mentality in the ancient world, you can imagine it's hard to convert. Unless you can be born, take on a family line. And basically that's what Paul argues. We have that adoption. Yeah, we have that adoption. So I didn't mean to leave. But yeah. So we're almost done, and we'll come to a stop here. We'll connect this grammar to verse 4, at least give it some grounding. And then Paul adds to this relative pronoun clause, in which we all once lived, and we were children, teknaphusi, by nature of wrath, orges, even as the rest. Even as the rest. So this idea of being children by nature, and the question is, what kind of wrath is this? Children of wrath. And this could be meant in two senses. It can be meant as either children who receive wrath, in other words, they're going to receive punishment, or if this is a descriptive genitive, in terms of like an adjectival genitive, then it means that they're wrathful, angry children. Which is interesting. Which, you know, in our fallen conditions, where we have our flesh and our desires and our wills, if we're at odds with ourselves, we're angry with ourselves, but also we're going to be angry with each other and fighting and mad. So it's interesting. What does Paul mean by this? Does he possibly mean both? That we are both angry and wrathful towards life and each other, but then also receiving of, worthy of receiving God's wrath, as even the rest. So this condition extends to all people. Again, there's a reminder that it's extending to all. If the Pontes doesn't convey that, then this final, as even the rest are children of wrath, that is assumed. This os clause assumes the verb again and the statement. So it's basically continues to extend this out, that this is true of all people, all the rest. So us, you and I, we, and who I represent, but everybody, everyone is in the same boat. We're in the same condition. And so now, this great monstrous sentence, which is not grounded yet, gets its grounding in starts to get its grounding in verse 4 and ultimately in verse 5. O de theos plusios on en eleli diatein palein agapein avtu ein agapesen emas ke ontas emas necrus tis paraptomasin. And then we get the main verb. Soon e zo piesin to Christo. We were made, he made us alive. Okay, so he made us alive. That's grounding the whole thing. The precondition of that, first, is we being dead. We being dead because of our sins. That's the first part of verse 5. So that's a reset of verse 1, except it changes from a you being dead because of trespasses to now Paul's included the we being dead in our trespasses. Who made us alive? Well, here we have a great elaboration of God. Here is the subject, and it's being elaborated upon. But God, but God, rich being in mercy. This would be perhaps you can understand this as a circumstantial participle, maybe with a causal sense. But God, because he is rich in mercy, on account of his great love with which he loved us. So this relative pronoun goes back to agape and further elaborates it in a way that it's redundant. You see how redundant it is? You don't need to say with which he loved us because that's already, it's implied. But Paul is just wanting to even more stress this love and precisely, I guess, us as direct objects of that love. So that's what's accomplished by this real relative pronoun clause, is it allows him to sneak in, or not to really sneak in, to get in this emas, that we are the recipients of this love. And so probably I think what we're getting at is a core base motivation of God, that because he loves us with a great love, and because being rich in mercy, he's now made us alive with Christ, even in our condition of being dead in sins.
Yeah, so there's a question that I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
when Paul is making this statement about, let me assume that Paul is the one writing this article or this letter. He talks
Yes.
about the children of wrath doing the will of the flesh.
Yes.
And all of that, kind of the mind. Is he by any chance making any connection or contrast with Stoic? Since Asia Minor, is there any wrestling here with the idea of the more wise you are, the more reasonable your actions are, and the more you attain virtue? Something that we find in the 15th.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So is Paul writing this against a philosophical background of human optimism?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's worth thinking about. I'd want to track these terms of kind of will and desire and some of these verbs. I'd want to see if there's a network of topoi, and see if they are found natively in Stoic literature. It may be that Paul has been, I think he probably was aware of the currents of his day. I think Paul is a bit eclectic, honestly. I think he's a bit eclectic in terms of the philosophies that he's drawing on. But, to your point, I think what kind of lies behind it, is he addressing some acute, specific kind of ideology, philosophy, moral philosophy that is prevalent in Ephesus or Asia Minor, mid-1st century? And I think in order to answer that, you'd have to try to be as precise as you can with those points of comparison in order that you could make that claim. But I think generally you could say that he is aware of the kind of optimism that exists, and he would just say, no, we have fault and sin. There is there are failings and even missteps. So yeah, that's now whether he's getting there by way of kind of Jewish moral philosophy that has already had several centuries to chew on this and compare Jewish thinking and theological thinking and moral ethics with Greek thoughts. It's at least that. At least that is going on. He's an inheritor of that. But he also is traveling around. He's been in Ephesus for like over 2 years, right? 2.5 years teaching. Surely he would have been exposed to the current ideas. So what's the precise mixture of ideas here? It's a good question because it's a fair question because we see that he's being very intentional.
Yeah.
So in order to understand that, we'd have to really do some laser cutting in terms of what is the precise language, what's the network. And if we can map that to some contemporary, then we could start to say, it may be that he is tackling some system.
Okay.
The idea of self-sufficiency, just as a quick example, comes up in 2 Corinthians, which was a major Stoic idea of the self-sufficiency, and Paul lays it out in the middle of a chiasm, autarkion, huge concept. He lays it out, and it's in a chiasm. This verse is amazing. It's a chiasm, and I don't have time to show it here. It's really tight. It's really tight. And in the middle are 3 instances of pas and pantota. In fact, that's so unique in Greek literature. I did a search on that. En panti pantota pasan. That's the very middle of this chiasm. On either side is abounding in, you can see abounding in, all grace, all self-sufficiency. And so Paul is basically taking this Stoic idea of self-sufficiency and subordinated it to God's grace and enablement. And then as a basis to abounding to all good deeds, every good deed. So it's really quite amazing what he's done here. So he's conversant with some of this language, and it's always a good question to ask.
Of the will and the will, the flesh, and the reason take me up to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that's worth thinking about. Others have looked into this. I don't know how specific they've argued that. they do find a lot of correspondence between his thinking and other moral philosophers of his day, Greek and Greco-Roman.
I will ask a question next time, but I need to run the class. So I would like if you could talk a little more about the rhetorical setup of this chapter 2. You mentioned that the language is kind of like the grammar is set up to match the sense of what it's trying to write about.
Yeah.
The brokenness of human nature.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's a rhetorical summary in verse 5 that he draw from 2 verse 1 to 2 verse 5, and in between there is this broken grammar.
Yeah.
So is there any kind of in rhetorical criticism which you have strength in? Do you think that there's any particular kind of expertise going on there that might make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think there probably is. I've not studied the style as much as like larger disposition and argument forms, but I am certain that there was a premise that this content should be matched. Your style should match the content. So it's just a matter of just lining up those references to support that kind of claim.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. I will ask you that question.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to do all the research. That would be a whole paper. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we'll pick it up right here, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.